They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but what happens when the road to financial ruin is paved with outright theft? I've spent decades watching European politicians make catastrophic decisions, but what I'm about to reveal makes even the euro crisis look like a minor accounting error. Over the past few weeks, a plan has been quietly gestating in Brussels that would make even the most brazen kleptocrat blush. The European Commission wants to steal 140 billion euros of Russian assets and not freeze them, not hold them as leverage, steal them outright. And they're trying to dress this up as some sort of moral crusade, but it's what they don't want you to know. This isn't just about Russia anymore. It's about the complete breakdown of international law, and it's about to backfire spectacularly. I've been following European politics since the common market days, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, I have never seen such a dangerous combination of legal illiteracy and economic desperation as what we're witnessing right now in Brussels. And the country standing in their way? Belgium. Yes, Belgium, and that nation we usually mock for its bureaucratic excess, has become the unlikely defender of basic legal principles. You see, when even the Belgians think your legal scheme is too dodgy, you know you've crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. Let me take you back to how we got here, because the story begins long before Putin set foot in Ukraine. It begins with a fundamental misunderstanding of how international finance actually works. When the war began in February 2022, Western governments froze Russian central bank assets held in their jurisdictions. This was presented as a temporary measure, a way to pressure Russia into ending its military operation. The word frozen is crucial here. In legal terms, freezing assets means temporarily restricting access while retaining the underlying ownership. It's like putting a lock on someone's safe. You prevent them from opening it, but you don't tell the safe belongs to you. But somewhere between then and now, a remarkable transformation occurred in European thinking. The assets weren't just frozen anymore. They had somehow become available for real allocation. The safe wasn't just locked. European officials started eyeing its contents as their own property. This linguistic sleight of hand reveals everything you need to know about the moral bankruptcy of the current European leadership. Now you might be thinking, so what? Russia invaded Ukraine. Why shouldn't their money be used to rebuild what they destroyed? It's a superficially appealing argument, the kind that plays well on social media and in newspaper editorials, but it reveals a catastrophic ignorance of how the international financial system actually functions. Here's what the European Commission doesn't want to discuss publicly. If you can simply declare foreign assets available for reallocation because you disagree with that country's foreign policy, you've just blown up the entire foundation of international finance. Think about it. Why would any country hold significant reserves in European banks if those reserves can be confiscated the moment that country does something Brussels disapproves of? Why would any central bank trust the European financial system if legal ownership can be overturned by political decree? The Commission has tried to address this obvious problem by inventing elaborate legal justifications. They've produced hundreds of pages of documentation explaining why this particular confiscation is different, why it's legal, why it's necessary. But here's the thing about elaborate legal justifications. When you need hundreds of pages to explain why something isn't theft, it's probably theft. And the Belgians know it. Belgium hosts Euroclear, the central security depository where most of these Russian assets are actually held. When the Commission first floated their confiscation plan, Belgian officials quietly pointed out a rather inconvenient fact. Under Belgian law, what the Commission was proposing was straightforward theft. This created a fascinating standoff. The Commission needed Belgium's cooperation to access the assets, but Belgium's own legal system prevented them from cooperating. So began one of the most surreal diplomatic negotiations in modern European history. For months, Commission officials had been shuttling between Brussels and Belgian government offices trying to find some legal framework that would allow Belgium to participate in what is, by any reasonable definition, an elaborate heist. They've proposed indemnification schemes, insurance mechanisms, legal frameworks that would supposedly protect Belgium from the inevitable lawsuits. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. No other European government has been willing to share the legal liability with Belgium. Think about that for a moment. The Commission is asking Belgium to take all the legal risk for a plan that supposedly serves the entire European Union's interests. When German Chancellor Scholz was asked whether Germany would share liability for potential court judgments against Euroclear, the response was silence. When French President Macron was asked the same question, more silence. When Italian Prime Minister Meloni was asked, you get the picture. This tells you everything you need to know about how confident European leaders actually are in the legal foundation of their confiscation scheme. They want the money, but they don't want to face the consequences when international courts start issuing judgments. And those consequences are coming. Russian lawyers have been quietly preparing for this moment for months. They've been mapping out legal challenges in multiple jurisdictions, identifying the strongest grounds for challenging asset seizures, building coalitions with other countries that might face similar treatment in the future. Because here's what European officials seem to have forgotten. Russia isn't some small, isolated country with no legal resources. It's a major power with sophisticated legal and financial capabilities, extensive international relationships, and a strong incentive to make any confiscation as legally and financially painful as possible for Europe. But the real genius of the Russian legal strategy isn't just the direct challenges to asset seizure. It's the broader campaign to establish precedents that would make European financial centers too risky for international use. If Russia can successfully argue in courts around the world that European asset seizures violate international law, they create legal precedents that would affect far more than just Russian assets. They create uncertainty about the security of any foreign assets held in European financial centers. This brings us to what I consider the most damaging aspect of this entire affair, the revelation that European leaders fundamentally misunderstand how international finance works in the 21st century. London became a global financial center, not because of superior technology or better regulations, but because of legal predictability. International investors chose London because they trusted that British law would protect their assets regardless of political winds. They believed that legal ownership meant legal ownership, not legal ownership subject to political approval. The same principle was applied to other major financial centers. Zurich, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, they all built their reputations on legal reliability on the principle that politics and law operate in separate spheres. What the Commission is proposing destroys this fundamental principle. It announces to the world that European law is subordinate to European politics, that legal ownership is subject to political approval, that assets held in European financial centers are only as secure as the current political relationship between the asset owner's country and Brussels. This is not a theoretical concern. Since news of the confiscation plan began circulating, several countries have quietly begun diversifying their reserve holdings away from European institutions. The amounts aren't dramatic yet, but the trend is unmistakable. China, in particular, has been shifting reserves toward institutions and jurisdictions where property rights are more predictable. Ironically, this is one of the very tax havens that European officials spend so much time condemning. But the immediate political crisis is unfolding right now, and it's tearing at the fabric of European unity in ways that Brussels clearly didn't anticipate. France and Italy have now joined Belgium in opposing the confiscation scheme, but their opposition isn't based on legal principles, it's based on a different financial calculation. Both countries prefer the alternative proposal for Eurobonds. Here's why. Eurobonds would allow heavily indebted countries like France and Italy to have their borrowing guaranteed by the more creditworthy countries like Germany and the Netherlands. It's a way of socializing European debt, something both countries have wanted for years. So when faced with the choice between a legally dubious confiscation scheme and a mechanism for making Germany pay for French and Italian spending, guess which option they prefer? This has created an extraordinary situation where the ostensible goal, funding Ukraine, has become secondary to settling old scores within the European Union itself. German Chancellor Scholz now faces an impossible choice. He can support the confiscation scheme, which would make Germany liable for the inevitable legal judgments and severely damage the credibility of European financial centres. Or he can support Eurobonds, which would make German taxpayers liable for French and Italian spending in perpetuity. Neither option is politically viable in Germany. German public opinion is already turning against continued Ukraine support, and adding massive financial liability on top of existing commitments would be electoral suicide. But here's the most remarkable aspect of this entire crisis. Throughout all these negotiations, no one seems to have asked the fundamental question of whether this scheme would actually help. The 40 billion euros wouldn't arrive as a lump sum tomorrow. The Commission's plan involves a complex mechanism of loans backed by frozen asset interest payments spread out over many years, subject to various conditions and requirements. Meanwhile, Ukraine's immediate funding needs are desperate and urgent. The country is struggling to maintain basic government functions, pay public sector salaries, keep the electrical grid functioning. They need billions of euros now, not complex financial instruments that might generate funding over the next decade. There's also the rather obvious point that if this confiscation scheme destroys confidence in European financial centres, it could ultimately cost far more than 140 billion euros in reduced investment and financial activity. London learned this lesson the hard way in the 1960s and 70s. Political interference in financial markets drove massive amounts of capital offshore, devastating London's position as a global financial centre. It took decades to rebuild that credibility. The Commission seems to believe that European financial markets are so important that international investors have no choice but to accept whatever legal uncertainties Brussels creates. This reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how mobile international capital has become in the 20th. Singapore, Dubai, Hong Kong, even New York, all offer alternatives to European financial centres. If European law becomes unpredictable, international capital will simply go elsewhere. Which brings us to the broader geopolitical implications of this crisis. For decades, Europe has presented itself as the champion of rules-based international order. European officials never tire of lecturing other countries about the importance of international law, the need to respect legal frameworks, the danger of allowing politics to override legal principles. Yet here we have the European Commission proposing to override fundamental principles of property law for political reasons. The hypocrisy is so blatant that even European diplomats struggle to explain it with straight faces. This matters far beyond the immediate crisis. If Europe can't credibly champion international law when it's inconvenient, why should anyone else take European lectures about rules-based order seriously? China has already begun using this crisis to deflect criticism of its own legal and financial practices. When European officials criticize Chinese restrictions on foreign investment, Chinese diplomats simply point to the Russian asset confiscation scheme as evidence of European hypocrisy. Russian diplomats have been even more direct, using European legal inconsistency to justify their own departure from various international agreements and frameworks. The damage to European credibility extends far beyond these immediate cases. Smaller countries that have traditionally looked to Europe as a model of legal reliability are beginning to question whether European institutions can be trusted to respect their own stated principles when pressure mounts. This brings us to what may be the most damaging long-term consequence of this crisis, the precedent it sets for future international disputes. If European governments can confiscate foreign assets because they disapprove of those countries' foreign policies, what's to stop other countries from doing the same thing to European assets when they disapprove of European foreign policies? China holds massive amounts of European corporate assets and investments. What happens if Beijing decides that European policies toward Taiwan justify confiscating those assets? India holds significant European financial assets. What if New Delhi decides that European immigration policies justify seizure? The Commission seems to believe that they can create a one-way precedent that European confiscation of Russian assets is legitimate, but any retaliation would be illegitimate aggression. This reveals a breathtaking degree of naivety about how international relations actually work. Power, not legal principle, will determine whether these precedents apply more broadly. If Europe is strong enough to make confiscation work without facing retaliation, the precedent will remain limited. If Europe is too weak to prevent retaliation, the precedent will spread rapidly. Given the current state of European economies, the latter scenario seems more likely. German industrial production is falling off a cliff. French government debt is approaching crisis levels. Italian economic growth has stagnated. The British public finances are in chaos. These are not the economic foundations of a bloc that can afford to play fast and loose with international legal principles. But perhaps the most damning aspect of this entire affair is what it reveals about the quality of strategic thinking in European capitals. The Commission's plan appears to have been developed without serious consideration of Russian responses, without meaningful consultation with European financial institutions, without adequate legal review, and without realistic assessment of the long-term consequences. This is policy making by wishful thinking, the same mindset that led to the euro crisis, the migration crisis, and the energy crisis. European officials seem to believe that because their intentions are good, supporting Ukraine, the consequences of their actions will somehow be benign. This is magical thinking of the most dangerous kind. Reality doesn't care about intentions. If you destroy legal predictability, international capital will flee regardless of your motivations. If you create precedents for asset confiscation, other countries will use those precedents regardless of your hopes. If you blow up the foundations of international finance, the resulting chaos will affect everyone, regardless of your original goals. The tragedy is that there were alternative approaches available that could have achieved the same goals without creating these massive risks. European governments could have increased direct funding to Ukraine through conventional budget mechanisms. They could have negotiated burden-sharing agreements with other allies. They could have implemented more effective sanctions that actually changed Russian behavior rather than simply creating legal chaos. Instead, they chose the path that maximizes legal risk, financial uncertainty, and political division within Europe itself. This brings us to the current moment, where the entire scheme appears to be falling apart in real time. Belgium's resistance has proven more stubborn than the Commission anticipated. The addition of French and Italian opposition has created a blocking minority that makes any decision impossible under current EU voting rules. Even if those political obstacles could be overcome, the legal challenges are mounting. Russian lawyers have filed preliminary objections in multiple jurisdictions, and several neutral countries have indicated they may support Russian legal challenges on grounds of protecting international legal principles. The Commission's response has been to double down, to insist that the scheme must proceed, that alternatives are unacceptable, that European unity depends on making this work. This is exactly the wrong approach when you're in a hole. Stop digging. The sensible path forward would be to abandon this scheme before it causes even more damage to European credibility and financial stability. Focus on conventional funding mechanisms for Ukraine, rebuild trust in European legal institutions, restore the separation between politics and law that has been the foundation of European financial success. But I see no sign that European leaders have the wisdom or humility to take this sensible path. Instead, they seem determined to pursue this scheme until it either succeeds spectacularly or fails catastrophically. Given the legal and financial fundamentals involved, catastrophic failure seems far more likely. The ultimate irony is that this scheme was supposed to demonstrate European strength and unity in the face of Russian aggression. Instead, it has revealed European weakness, division, and confusion about their own fundamental principles. If you want to understand why European influence is declining globally, look no further than this crisis. When Europe can't maintain consistent legal principles, can't build consensus among its own members, and can't anticipate obvious consequences of its own actions, why should anyone take European leadership seriously? Well, 40 billion euros may seem like a lot of money, but the long-term cost of this legal and political disaster will be far higher. Europe is trading its credibility as a guardian of international law for short-term political posturing. History will not judge this kindly.